My name is Ian Spanier. I'm a professional photographer based in Los Angeles, California. Join me today on this exclusive behind-the-scenes look at a typical portrait photo shoot that I do. We're going to be working today with Brandon Wise, owner of the Wise Hatter, a custom hat maker in Venice, California. I'm going to be sharing with you guys everything that I do to prepare for my photo shoots before the photo shoot even happens, figuring out what equipment I'm going to be using, and then working on location with that same equipment, dealing with the challenges that working on location can present, as well as some of the things that I do to finalize my images before I hand them off to a client. Something I've done my entire career is keep a notebook of all of my photo sets. This allows me to start with a foundation and a plan to start with, and should things go awry, I now have a launching pad rather than feel like I'm stumbling trying to move forward. The added bonus of the notebook is I have a reference point that I can always go back to should I need to repeat the look of a certain kind of photo shoot. Now, I had the good fortune of having already been to this location once, so I essentially had a scout at this location. So I knew as well that I couldn't bring a lot of big equipment because the space is pretty small. Because I've already laid out a plan of what essentially I think I want to do today, I know I can pack fairly minimally. I bring just enough so that I know I can get done what I've got planned, and if there are any variables, I've got coverage just in case I switch my plan or I see something that I hadn't anticipated prior to getting to the location. This only puts you in a better position to win. I always recommend that if you have the opportunity to scout a location first, you always should. But if you don't, ask a lot of questions of your client or wherever the location might be. No matter what location I'm walking into, the very first thing I'll do is look up at the ceiling. I always like to know what limitation I'm going to have with ceiling height in regards to where I can place my lights should I decide to be placing them at a high angle. From there, I'm essentially seeing what other things might challenge me from setting up the way that I had anticipated prior to the photo shoot. What changes will I have to make, and where will I place my lights for the kinds of portraits that I'm trying to make? Once I've got my plan in my mind on how I'm either going to stick with what I scripted beforehand or maybe deviate a little bit, I start breaking out the gear. As I mentioned earlier, when I had the opportunity to scout this location previously, I knew I couldn't bring in a lot of equipment. So I'm working fairly lightweight today, and then also trying to minimize the footprint that I'm going to take so that I can really just move through the space without a lot of moving parts. My key light today is going to be on a C-stand with a Matthews mini boom. This will allow me to boom light over some of the limitations of space that are at the location. The C-stand is a bit sturdier than the lightweight kit stand that you saw me take out first. I'll mount both my Westcott FJ200s on these two stands, and that's pretty much all I'm going to need at this location. I'm adding an S-bracket to my Westcott FJ200 strobe. The modifier will be a Rapid Box Beauty Dish, which is 24 inches, with a white interior and a white baffle on the front to soften the light. I'm going to use this to mimic the feel of light coming through the doorway with a little bit more direction at my subject. I'm intentionally leaving the door open when I do this, as you'll see as we get further on in the setup. I'm doing that to have a sort of quality of light that's not too different than what natural light would feel like if it was coming through the window of the door at that angle. Because I'm controlling the light, I'm able to direct it at my subject exactly how I would like. unlike when you need to wait for the sun when you're using natural light to be in a certain position. This is one of the huge advantages of working with LEDs or strobes that you're controlling. As I'm going about this process of setting up the lights, I'm thinking through my head exactly how I want this to look. What aperture do I want to shoot at? One of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of photographers make is think that they can just judge this off the back of the camera. So they play around with their strobes, dialing it up or dialing it down until it looks like what they think it should look like, and then shooting from there, rather than be precise. The only true way to understand light and to do this precisely is through the use of a light meter. So with that, I'm thinking, what aperture do I want to shoot this portrait at? The Rapid Box Beauty Dish is one of my go-to light modifiers. The reason I love it so much is that it really is one of those variable modifiers that allows you to have a number of different looks within one modifier. The baffle and the grid are both great options, as well as removing both of them in order to have a different quality of light come out of the strobe, or nowadays you can even attach them to the LED lights that Westcott makes, which gives me a lot of advantages and a lot of options. I'm definitely somebody that likes to travel with minimal equipment, but still have a lot of variable options available to me. In this case, I'm going to start off with the baffle. I do want to soften the light, because if it was light coming through a window and not necessarily fully direct light like sunlight would feel, then it would be a little diffused. So I'm intentionally putting this diffusion over the front of the strobe in order to soften and spread the light out a little bit. This will also add more light to the room, because anytime that you put diffusion in front of your light, you're going to spread it out a little bit. So this gives me an advantage that I don't have to have a lot of lights to light up the space. One of the main reasons I utilize the FJ200 series on location is their portability. To be able to work wire-free in any location always puts me at an advantage for speed and for the compact nature of working with them. Being able to travel with some powerful lights that are in a compact package really puts me in an advantage in most locations. I'm not heavily reliant on assistance. I'm not heavily reliant on a ton of cases or a big truck in order to get my gear to the location. And the little powerhouses that these are really put me in a great space to create a beautiful quality of light no matter where I am. I often talk about the great teaching of light that came from the natural world for me. I wasn't a student of lighting. I was a photography student. However, we didn't really have lights at the school that I went to, much beyond 2 silver dishes from Home Depot with a couple of 60-watt bulbs. So instead, I took a lot of lessons from what I witnessed in the natural world. What does the sun do in different times of day, different times of year, different atmospheric conditions, all of the things that affect the quality of light. And I made mental notes of these different things, and then once I got my hands on equipment, I tried to replicate those things that I was responding to. My initial thought was to fire my strobe into the ceiling to create room light. But when I reminded myself by walking in and looking up at the ceiling that the ceiling was wood and not your typical ceiling of white, I needed to do something else to modify that light, unless I wanted to have a warm light source coming from the ceiling. So I'm going to add a 24-inch umbrella which has white diffusion on it. This will allow me to add some fill to my subject and the room without having that warm quality of light hitting everything and affecting the color temperature of the room in a great way. Now I'm going to be setting this strobe at 2 stops under my key light. That's so it has an effect on the image, but nothing that really creates more light to the situation that will change the quality of light that I'm putting on my subject directly with the Rapid Box Beauty Dish. This is all designed with intention so that I have information in the shadows that I can decide later on to take away if I want, But at the very least, if I decide to keep it, then I have some information there that will allow me to have detail in my shadows. Now, each of my strobes is set to their own group. I have a trigger called the FJ-X3M on camera, which will allow me to control the strobes once they're up in their position. I can turn them up, turn them down, put them to sleep, put the sound on, put the modeling light on, or basically anything I want to do in terms of controlling these strobes from camera. This is a huge advantage when working on location. Since I've already determined in my mind what aperture I want to shoot at, all I'm doing with the light meter is confirming the output of the strobe to match that aperture setting. I've set the same ISO that the camera is set at, as well as the shutter speed that I plan to shoot at, and all I'm doing with the FJ-X3M trigger is firing the strobe and taking a light meter reading in order to get that aperture to its proper setting. A lot of photographers seem to be intimidated by the use of a light meter. If you understand the inverse relationship of shutter speed and aperture, you can easily understand how to use a light meter to get the best exposure in your very first exposure. Something that will always impress your clients as well as get the job done more efficiently. In this case, I'm aiming for f5.6 at ISO 200 at 1/200th of a second. Once I have my key light set, I then move on to the fill light. I'll turn the key light to sleep and take a reading without affecting anything else by only firing this fill light. I want something here at about a 2-stop under ratio, meaning that if I'm shooting at 5.6 with my key light, my fill light should be about 2.0. Once I have that reading correct, I'll turn my key light back on and take a reading of both strobes firing just to make sure that the overall setting still matches the intended 5.6. When it comes to the accessories that I utilize to make my job easier, I can't say enough good things about Spyder holster, as well as Cam Ranger, two staples in my kit that are always allowing me to just work more efficiently and in a smarter way. The Cam Ranger allows for a JPEG to be sent to a tablet or a computer, which allows me to wirelessly be tethered, if you want to put it that way. Something that's great to be able to show my clients and my subjects images almost in real time. Spyder holster, I rely on to be hands-free with a lot of the action that I'm doing throughout the process of moving lights, and then also just the handy hand strap, for lack of a better way of saying it, which makes for very comfortable and very easy use for my camera. And then Hoodman memory cards, which I rely on every shoot. And of course, all of it being held within Think Tank photo bags, something that protects all of my gear no matter where I'm going. So as much as I rely on my light meter to get accurate readings from my light sources, I will always argue that the feel of light can trump those numbers at any time. So if something, say, feels better a half stop below or a half stop above my actual readings, I'm okay with that, and I'll adjust the camera to suit. Now, of course, this can be done in a number of different ways. You can change your shutter speed, your aperture, or your ISO in order to accommodate to that feel that you're going for. Quite often, I'll actually open up about a third of a stop on my aperture to accommodate more exposure in my image, and that's just for my personal feel. To add to the natural feel to the image, I'm actually going to have my subject turn the lights on in the room so that I can make an exposure that takes that into account and feels a little bit more realistic. The idea of using strobes is all about creating artificial light. But with that artificial light, if I can recreate something that feels more like natural light, then I put myself at a better advantage for a successful image. The other aspect that's an advantage for using the strobe is you're sort of enhancing what natural light could look like. Sure, you can make great images with natural light, but when you can control it completely with a strobe or an LED, you have the advantage of creating light directed exactly where you want it to be and exactly where you don't want it to be. Adding a little bit of room light will just sort of make the image feel a little bit more like it would feel naturally. So I'll play around a little bit with my shutter speed and take into account that the lower the shutter speed, the more those lights will come into play. Now, of course, I can read them with my light meter as well, but I want this to be very subtle, so I already know that those lights are not very powerful, especially compared to my strobes. Now, as I make my test frames, you can see immediately that my exposure is very, very close to the final. Here I'll make little tweaks to adjust to really capture that feel that I'm talking about. Try to make the image have both the sort of natural quality of light as well as the unnatural quality of light combined in order to create the image that I'm trying to create. So my exposures are with and without strobe, so I can see what all the lights are doing and then make my adjustments from there. I'm also making exposures with one strobe firing and the other one asleep, and then both strobes firing, just to make sure that the light's doing what I expect it to do. Now, one of the techniques that I use quite often is something called dragging the shutter. It's basically where you use a slower shutter speed in order to allow whatever light is available in the room, be it artificial or natural, to take play into the final exposure of your image. This is something that can help lessen the shadows that are created when you are using strobe lights, especially when you're directing lights through a small source, which will obviously create a lot of shadow. After these final test frames, I'll make any last adjustments to the strobes that I want. In this case, I'm actually going to use the door to block a little bit of that strobe, so you might notice the piece of wood at the top of the door. That's going to help block a little bit of the light so that when it hits my subject, it has that more natural feeling of coming through the doorway. I'll also be explaining to my subject where the lights are coming from and directing them to where I want them to mostly look for most of the frames that I'm making. I do like to let my subjects lead to some degree, but ultimately I want to make sure that their faces fall within the light that I'm directing towards them. I always think it's important to explain to my subject what I'm going for so that they get a sense of where I'd like them to be, sort of directing their eyes and the angle of their face and all of those parts in order to capture the best image I can quickly. On any photo shoot, I'll have to make a judgment call of whether to share images with my subject or not. It's something that I would say falls in the category of psychology, that you really just have to read your subject, whether it's going to enhance your images for them to be able to respond to what they're seeing, or if it's going to put them in a position of being more self-conscious than they might already be. I often get asked if I shoot a lot of frames on a photo shoot, and the truth is I don't. I don't like the idea of what I call spray and pray, which is just shooting a ton of frames to just hopefully get what you want. I sort of go the old school route and choose to try to make an image, not just take an image. That said, sometimes for clients you need to make a lot of images for them to feel satisfied that they got a full photo shoot, so it's really a judgment call in that sense. When I know I have the shot, I very much so move on to the next setup so that I can be efficient and keep my subject entertained so that I don't lose them. And I think that that's more important than firing off a ton of frames. Regardless of the plan that I have going in, I'm always keeping an eye out for other great opportunities when I'm working on location. The light on this yellow wall was amazing, so I figured out I'd have to do a portrait with Brandon against the wall. I'm going to do a mix of strobe and sunlight for the first shot, so I'm taking a meter reading of what the sunlight is doing so that I can slightly overpower it with my strobe and create a certain mood to this portrait. I'm going to set up that same rapid box beauty dish at a high and down angle, opposite of the sun in this case, mostly because of the space that I have to work with. Whenever I'm working in a location that's limited on space, it's always good to be able to have equipment that fits into that space so that I can get the light that I want without sacrificing any quality. I'm going to add a grid to this rapid box beauty dish in order to cut the light from the background and focus it mostly on Brandon. This will help with not really changing the background too much from what it is naturally, and also being able to concentrate the light right onto my subject. Once again, I'll break out the meter and take a meter reading. For this, I'm going to go slightly over what I read for the available light in order to create a powerful and moody image. Whenever I'm working in a situation like this, I know that my subject doesn't fully comprehend what I'm doing unless they've had any experience with photography. So this is one I'm definitely going to share with Brandon so that he can see exactly what I'm going for. I feel like this is something that helps quite often with letting your subject be a part of the photo shoot. There's a great saying about there's always two people in a portrait, the photographer and the subject, and I truly believe that is accurate. Who would I be if I didn't take some portraits with available light? After all, that was my greatest teacher. So now I'm going to do some pictures without the strobe firing. Brandon, of course, was all too happy to break out a cigar and enjoy that while I was making more portraits. As I talked about earlier, what we learn from natural light is something that really helps us see and understand light. So any opportunity I have to make some portraits with available light, I'm going to go for it. This also adds to my arsenal of solutions for any situation that I'm in where I may not have access to artificial light. Something I always look for on a location shoot is a white wall. Being a huge fan of Richard Avedon's series of the American West, I always love to make portraits of my subjects against the white wall in that style if I get the opportunity. Once again, using my meter, I'll take what's known as an open shade situation and take a reading of what the light looks like back towards camera. Now I do this same technique when I'm shooting with strobes or LED lights as well. I always want to make my incident light meter reading towards camera because it's what the camera is going to interpret that I'm trying to capture the most accurate aperture setting to do so. With Brandon, it made total sense to try to make a portrait like this. So I noticed that there was a white wall just across from his shop door, and although it wasn't very big, I would be able to use it in that style. I'm never a big fan of the phrase, "we'll fix it later" in Photoshop. I think there's always a better way to create images where, just out of camera, you pretty much have what you need. So in the case of something like this, where I know that the window to Brendan's right and the door to Brendan's left are going to be a factor in the final portrait that I do here, those are situations where it's much easier for me to go ahead and say I can fix it later in post than it is to break out a white seamless when I might not have one, or anything along those lines. Such a simple background fix is really something that I think is acceptable when it comes down to the statement, "we'll fix it later in post." The great Joe McNally once said, always put your camera away last. So it's something that I've always latched onto and followed the rule. Everything's packed up and I'm ready to go. And just as I'm about to shut the camera case, so as Brandon wheeled out the bike, I set up to do one more portrait against a white background, which happened to be in the parking lot straight across from my car. Much in the same style as the portrait I just did, I'm able to capture Brandon in his natural element, aka sitting on a bike. It's always great when a subject brings an idea to you, because that means that they truly want to be photographed in that situation. So complying with Brandon's request was a no-brainer. Ending the day on a high note? Well, that's always a good day for me. All images can use a little Photoshop love. Lightroom is my annual catalog of imagery. So the first changes happening there are kept on file that way, and then I output the image in a high resolution TIFF or sometimes a medium resolution JPEG if the image is ultimately only going to live for social media or online only. For all images, I start with a mix of the Remove tool, Healing brush, and the Clone tool to remove any distracting elements. This is my time to clean up the image, if you want to think of it that way, from all those elements that might just pull your eye away from the main point of the image, meaning my subject. I knew when I was making this portrait, the oil painting on the wall behind Brandon was reflecting my strobe. So I intentionally made a frame without the strobe firing so that I could place the image within that frame and the distracting reflection would be gone. Whenever I'm retouching people, I aim towards the side of being subtle. Most of the work that I do is anywhere on the image from 100 to 400% zoomed in. I do this intentionally so that the changes that I make are more of the subtle nature, so that when you zoom out, those changes are not fully seen, but they're definitely noticed. I'll zoom in and out of my image constantly to check my work and also look for other distracting elements that I might want to remove that maybe I didn't catch on the first pass. I also love to work with adjustment layer masks and other masks on any image that I'm working on. These masks allow you to make changes to the image without destroying the bottom layer or base layer of the image. This also allows for time to make subtle changes just very simply by painting on or painting off of that mask. I'll actually do most of my color correction by using this method. So I'll open up a hue and saturation layer and remove the colors that shouldn't be a part of the image, and then paint back into the image the colors that I do want to remain, or perhaps ones that I've removed some saturation from that I want to remain saturated in the final image. You'll see I also use a dodge and burn layer. This dodge and burn layer is something I do to almost all of my images. I truly believe that for two-dimensional images to look more three-dimensional, adding shadow and light to the image that you already created only pushes that idea further. This dodge and burn technique that I use is through using a separate layer that's 50% gray and then painting black or white at a very low opacity to add either shadow or light to the image. My final touch to all images is a little bit of extra sharpening, even though I've already sharpened my image to some degree in Lightroom. This will just enhance the image and have that nice crisp quality that I love. With anything you do in Photoshop, just the same as anything you do with your camera in hand, you're looking to create a signature style that will become part of who you are as a photographer. Let's face it, everyone with an iPhone these days is a photographer, so standing out from the crowd is essential. In order to do so, creating a style that fits how you see the world is really the best road to travel on. Recently, I decided to embrace the changes that are coming forth in retouching through the use of AI. I found a program called Envato AI, and I really love the things that are changing every day in their software. One of the latest updates to the software is a background removal tool. It allows you to remove the distracting elements of a background so simply, and it just saves me a ton of time in Photoshop. So even if it doesn't fully complete the job for me, it allows me to save a few moments of time and then finish the image in Photoshop. Remember the window and the door that I mentioned earlier next to Brandon on the white wall? My theories about light have always been the same. Light is the true way to help tell the story that you're trying to create when you're making images of your subject. Understanding light is the key element to truly being able to tell stories with your camera, and part of understanding light is knowing how to use it to your advantage. Photography, after all, literally doesn't exist without light. Once again, this is Ian Spanier. Thanks for joining me for this in-depth look for how I work on location.
When I walk around, baby, I got this knife in my back.